Thank you. I wanted to thank the organizers and Teresa especially for inviting me here. I'm really looking forward to learning a lot at this workshop, and hopefully I'll also be able to contribute a bit. Although I have to say I am not an expert on machine learning, so I am something of an expert on law, or at least U.S. law. So that's the perspective I'm going to take. I think that the things I have to say are going to follow very nicely on the first presentation. I also follow on the first presentation in that I also have a bad cold, so that seems to be a theme. But hopefully I'll be able to keep my voice until I get to the end. All right. So where I'm going to start, or the perspective I want to think about, is to kind of ask the question from a lawyer's perspective of why do we require, and I'm going to focus on government decision making here, but I think many of the themes are also applicable in certain other kinds of contexts, commercial contexts, and so forth. So I'm going to start with the question of why do we require explanations of government decisions? Well, first of all, do we require explanations of government decisions? In the US, we call this procedural due process, and the law says that if you are a subject of a government decision, you have certain appropriate procedural protections that you may demand. But there's nothing very hard and fast about what's required. Whether or not you get a hearing and get to present witnesses and so on and so forth depends on various things, like how big is your interest, what's the risk that you're going to be deprived of your interest, and so how expensive would this be for the government? What are the government's interests? But out of all of this, one can say that it emerges that having an explanation for a decision that affects you is a core aspect of due process and is required in many, many contexts. So for example, judges usually provide some kind of explanation of their decision, either written or oral. Although they're not always required to do that, it is a traditional and common. Administrative agencies that make rules are required to respond to comments on those rules, comments and critiques of those rules, and give some rationale for why they changed the rule or didn't. Agencies that engage in adjudications, there are many different kinds of these, provide reasons for their decisions. Now, of course, explanation is not always required. So, for example, jury decisions don't require any explanation. Judges explain their decisions, juries don't. The rationale for that is some kind of idea of democratic legitimacy. A jury is a jury of your peers. The idea is you don't need an explanation because you have your peers looking out for you. Similarly with legislative enactments. The legislature sometimes explain the rationale for what they're doing. There's no requirement that they do so, and part of that has to do with the fact that there's an assumption of democratic legitimacy. And then, of course, if it seems like the action doesn't have a very significant impact on you, then there may also be no requirement to explain, or if the government has a good reason not to explain. And one of the main examples of this, which I might return to at the end if I have time, is investigations. So the decision to target someone for investigation doesn't normally require any particular procedural protections for that individual. So I'm going to think about there being two sorts of explanations of government decisions, and this is really just sort of a functional description. So I know that there are many, many ways of categorizing explanations and reasons and so forth. Philosophers debate the different categories of explanation. So this is really for functional purposes. So for functional purposes, I think we can say that an explanation of a decision, so if I explain a decision to you, usually has two parts. One part is a sort of what I could call a descriptive explanation. It answers the question, how did decision maker X arrive at outcome Y? What did I do? What's the process I went through to make it to this decision? So this is just descriptive. It doesn't have a normative valence. And if I want to criticize this kind of descriptive explanation, there are a few ways I can do it. I can say you have your facts wrong. You based your decision on incorrect empirical facts. I could say you made some logical mistakes in your legal analysis. So legal analysis is supposed to compart with certain norms and practices of logical analysis. Or I could say, I don't actually believe that that's how you made that decision. Your explanation's not credible. We also have normally when a government actor explains a decision, it may also involve a justification. So why is this the right decision? Which is a different question for how did I get to this decision? Why is this the right decision? This, of course, is normative. And if I want to criticize your normative justification, I might criticize it by saying, I don't like your normative values. I have different normative values. I disagree. Or I could just say, even if I agree with your normative values, your justification is not persuasive. And when I try to think about how this explanation fits into legal decision making, we can, and this is very rough because there is certainly overlap here, we can divide legal decision making into two parts. So the first part is legal interpretation. So I start with some law. Maybe it's a statute, maybe it's a rule from an agency, maybe it's just a common law rule that has developed over time, if you have a common law system. But at some point I'm going to have to interpret that law. Why? Well, because so take the legislature, for example. When a legislature enacts a statute, they don't normally, a legislation is not a complete mapping from all possible facts to outcomes, right? Might be nice if it was, but it's not. So usually it's made out of words, and those words have lots of ambiguities, and sometimes there have been technological or social changes that mean that I have to apply the law to situations that weren't even anticipated by the people who enacted it. So legal interpretation is almost never just straightforward. Sometimes it is, right? So maybe if I say the speed limit is whatever, kilometers per hour, then that's fairly easy to interpret. Although even there might be questions like, well, is there ever an exception to this? What if it's an emergency? What if, et cetera. But for many, many kinds of decisions, legal decisions, it's not straightforward, legal interpretation. And legal interpretation usually has normative aspects. So once I interpret the law, I am usually applying some sort of normative assessment of what are the policy goals of the law. And in order to explain a legal interpretation, I usually would have to provide both a descriptive explanation, how did I get to this decision, and also, because of the normative aspects, a justification. Then you can say, okay, once you've interpreted the law, we're going to apply the law to the particular facts of a particular situation. Of course, this isn't a bright line, and there's lots of discussion about this in legal theory, but let's pretend that we can separate them for now. In order to apply the law to the facts of a particular situation, I have to do two things. First of all, I have to figure out what the facts are, right? So there's a fact-finding stage. And then once I've got the facts, and I have my legal interpretation, I apply that legal interpretation to the facts using an analytical process, and I get out decision, right? So as long as the legal interpretation is taking care of the normative aspects here, mostly I'm just talking about a descriptive explanation. But most decisions are going to require both of these aspects. Okay, so why in the law do we require, when we do we require explanations of government decisions? And I'm going to just point out that I think there are probably many ways of categorizing these, but I think that I've got most of the ones that are discussed by commentators and in case law. 5 things. So one is we think, and I'll talk about them in a little bit more detail. One is we might say, if I require the decision maker to make an explanation, I'm going to end up improving the accuracy of the decision. Secondly, if I require an explanation, this is going to promote fair and unbiased decision making. Third, if I explain to you why I made the decision I did, that's going to promote legitimacy and trust in social institutions, in the government in this case. Fourth, if I explain what interpretation and how I applied the law in these particular facts, why you got the decision you did, that's going to promote compliance with the law. And finally, explanation shows respect for dignity, individual dignity and autonomy. So let me talk a little bit more about each one of these and how they're understood sort of just in traditional decision making. So we haven't gotten to in machine learning or big data yet. So the first question is, if I say we're going to make more accurate legal decisions, you have to ask what's an accurate, or what's an accurate government decision? What does it mean for the decision to be accurate? And there's a lot of discussion about accurate without thinking about this question, or at least not discussing this question of what does it mean. So in the framework that I'm thinking about here, it means that there's something like a correct legal interpretation and a correct application. And what do I mean by correct legal interpretation? Well, it should be consistent. If I've got a rule or statute, for example, which is text, it should be consistent with the text, right? So that's one example. And then there are many different methods, once you are consistent with the text, of explicating any ambiguities in the text. And there's a lot of debate and disagreement about which is the right one. But at least I have to have some appropriate method. I have to apply an acceptable method for how to explicate whatever ambiguities are left. And that is almost invariably going to require some kind of application of normative considerations. And so I have to use the right normative considerations, which are going to be gains from policy goals of the rule or statute, from sort of general normative considerations about in society, and so forth. And then I should be doing something analytically sound. I should be making an analytically sound interpretation. To say that the application of a particular legal interpretation is correct would mean that I've got accurate and relevant empirical facts. So I correctly determined whether or not the light was red when you ran it, and things like that. But also that I picked out the right relevant empirical facts. I'm making my decision not based on some random empirical facts, but on ones that are relevant. Then I got to use the right legal interpretation, and again, I've got to be empirically sound. So if this is a goal, this accuracy is the goal, then how does having the decision maker provide an explanation lead to improvement in the accuracy, or how do we expect it to? So there are a few different ways this could work. Obviously, it doesn't always work, and it's not perfect. But this is the idea behind it. It might be that just making the person explain will help them pinpoint their analysis, catch and avoid errors, right? And so I think anybody who's done sort of a math problem understands this, right? If you have to write down and show your work, you're more likely to see where you're going wrong. Another way is that if I have to make an explanation, and if it's going to be seen by other people, and most especially if it's going to be seen by the higher authority that reviews my decisions, then that gives me an incentive to be really careful in my decision making, not to be sloppy, because I don't like to have my decisions overturned or ridiculed or whatever. And then directly, when I have an explanation, that gives a basis for people who don't like my decision to dispute it, and for higher authorities to review it. And then on a more cumulative and long-term basis, if I have explanations of decisions as generally, I might improve the accuracy by promoting the development of the law. So either modifications of, that's interesting, either modifications of the legal interpretation, or maybe even reform of the law. And how does that work? Well, if I have all these explanations out there as applied to particular cases, that generally facilitates critique and debate in society, and also highlights potential situations where the current legal interpretation or the current law leads to problematic outcomes. So people can see, oh, gee, there are a lot of these cases where even though they're applying the rule, it's giving us bad undesirable outcomes, bad decisions that we don't like. And this may be really important in cases where there's technological change is affecting things, or just social change in general is affecting things. And both descriptive explanations and justifications can help to improve accuracy for these reasons. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, how does explanation promote fair and unbiased decisions? Well, why do we get unfair and biased decisions? If we understand that, we can maybe think that there are three reasons why this might happen. So one is the decision maker has pernicious motives explicitly. The decision maker wants to be unfair or discriminate. They want to favor their nephew, or they don't like people of a certain race, etc. Also, of course, these kinds of decisions might stem from implicit or unconscious bias. And finally, they might be unanticipated results of applying the law, applying sort of what appear to be correct legal interpretations. So if you have pernicious explicit motivations of the decision maker, then we can expect that decision makers will lie about their reasons, right? So nobody writes an explanation of their decision that says, well, I really just made this decision because I don't like your religion. Nobody says that. Instead, decision makers will attempt to obfuscate their true motivations. Now, so in that case, if they're lying about their explanations, how does it help us promote fair and unbiased decisions? Well, it may not. But it might be that by trying to obfuscate my true motivations, I'm not going to be able to make such a persuasive or analytically sound explanation of my decision making. And if that's true, then first of all, the decision maker themselves might recognize that they really can't write a very good explanation of their decision and be deterred from acting on illicit motives. Or even if they're not deterred, that might be possible for the implausibility of their explanation to lead to overturn of their decisions or correction of their decisions. As I said before, of course, this isn't going to always work. Now, if the bias is implicit, then the same problem will occur. We might still get unconvincing explanations, but the decision maker is not going to trying to lie or obfuscate. And so the decision maker themselves may recognize, you know, my explanation here is not really working, and potentially modify their decision. Similarly for reviewing authorities. But again, this is not guaranteed to work, especially if the implicit bias is shared by the reviewing authorities. And also if it's so implicit that it's just doesn't become evident to anyone. They might recognize the explanation isn't working that well, but not see the problem. What about explanation as a way of helping to avoid unintended consequences of correct applications of existing legal rules and interpretations? Here again, if we have explanations from lots of decisions, and we can compare them and accumulate them, this could allow us to highlight biased or unfair outcomes and promote reform in various ways. The people who are the subjects of these biased or unfair outcomes might gather together and start complaining, or it might just make it obvious, like everybody says, whoa, this seems to be leading to a lot of biased outcomes. So again, this might not work, and there are some problems with it. Obviously, we still get unfair and biased decisions. But we hope that providing explanations helps us try to avoid this. Okay, promoting legitimacy, and I think these first two explanations, or first two reasons for having explanations are the ones that are most, and for having process protections in general, the ones that are the most discussed when talking about machine learning and what we need to accomplish with machine learning to make it legitimate. But I think the last three are also very important. So promoting legitimacy and social trust is important for stability of government, democratic stability. So why is explaining decisions going to help with this? Well, there are a lot of empirical studies showing that, in general, the idea of procedural justice, the fact that people believe that they have been subject to fair procedures, generally promotes more favorable views of decision-making processes. So explanations are one aspect of procedural justice, and I think they are particularly likely to have this effect, because if I get a good explanation for the decision, even if it was adverse to me, I will at least feel that the institution that made this decision is legitimate. Now, as many other people have pointed out, procedural justice can have an evil twin, complacency in the face of substantive injustice. So I may be so happy with the procedure that I don't complain when I should. I got an unjust result, but the procedure sort of made me feel, lured me into feeling like, oh, everything is okay. So, for example, I could provide an elaborate hearing, I could let you present witnesses, and then I could just ignore everything you did and make my own unjust decision. This is a big worry about procedural justice that people talk about a lot. I do think, however, that explanation giving as an aspect of procedural justice is sort of a hard thing for the evil twin to do, for the reasons that we already discussed. It's hard to give a convincing explanation if you've completely ignored the arguments that were made by the individual.
So I think explanation is an aspect of procedural justice that's very likely to promote legitimacy and social trust. Promoting legal compliance. Why does explanation promote legal compliance? I think this is sort of obvious, that if I explain to you why the decision was made, it clarifies what the legal requirements are, remembering that law ordinarily requires interpretation, and so it's often not enough for me to just read the statute and then I'll know what to do. So for the subject of the decision, if they're going to face similar situations in the future, right? If I'm going to have to file taxes in the future, for example, I will know what to do, and I will be more able to comply. The same thing is true cumulatively for everyone when you see lots of explanations, especially if you've got some intermediary that aggregates all these explanations together and gives you sort of like a best practices guide or something like that. Of course, all this is assuming that promoting legal compliance is a good thing, that we have legitimate, democratically enacted law. You might argue, or in some situations people argue, that the evil twin of legal compliance is gaming the system, right? If people know, and this comes up a lot in automated decision-making context, if people know exactly how we're going about things, then they're going to be able to game the system. Well, is this a real concern? So first of all, I would say that ordinarily, in most situations where we're talking about legal decision-making, it's simply not a reasonable concern. Why? Well, because of the rule of law, right? Citizens ordinarily have the absolute right to know what the law is, and they are only required to comply strictly with the letter of the law. So, too bad if what they're doing is within the letter of the law, but not in the spirit of the law. Citizens have the right to do this. This is part of their autonomy as citizens. Gaming the system concern, I think, has much less area of application than one might initially think. Really, you can only have a concern of gaming the system when you have a decision that's made on discretionary grounds, and where the goal is not to ensure compliance, but some other goal. So, for example, getting back again, an example of this is targeting investigation. So, you often hear law enforcement officials say we can't tell people what the profile is that we're using to identify people for investigations, because if we do, they will just game the system and avoid the profile. I might talk a little bit, as I said, I may or may not talk a little bit more about investigations at the end, but even that has a somewhat limited range of applicability, because it only really works if the connection between the profile and the bad behavior is sort of loose in a certain way, right? So if this profile is something I have to do in order to have the bad behavior, then telling me that I can't do it is not a bad thing. It's going to deter the bad behavior. Okay, then finally, promoting dignity and autonomy. So explanations of decisions are inherently valuable because they show respect for the dignity of people who are affected by decisions. They also enhance autonomy because if people understand the law, then they have more autonomy. They have options about whether and how to comply with the law and avoid adverse action, or subject themselves to it, whichever, but it gives them more autonomy. Also, when you explain your decision to the people who are affected, it enhances their dignity because it treats them as democratic citizens rather than as simple subjects. What do I mean by that? Because if I have an explanation of my decision, I can complain about it, I can contest it, I can seek to have the law changed, I can talk to other people who like-minded people, and so forth. And that treats me as a democratic citizen, not just a subject of the government. Okay, so how does all this apply in the arena of automated decision-making? So a couple of questions that we should be interested in. I definitely don't have all the answers to these, so mostly I'm just going to raise questions. Well, such explanation is one tool that we have traditionally used for trying to accomplish these various purposes. It's not a perfect tool, but it's the tool we've used. So one question is, well, in the context of automated decision-making, does explanation become less important because we can substitute something else for accomplishing these same purposes? And do explanations actually serve these purposes when we're in the context of automated decision-making? So let's go back through these purposes again and see a few comments about how they work out in the automated decision-making context. So what about improving decision accuracy? So one of the claims that's commonly made about automated decision-making is that it improves accuracy of decisions, makes more accurate decisions. Now, this is clearly true in one particular respect, which is if I've got a well-defined legal interpretation, and I've got a well-defined set of facts that are relevant to that legal interpretation, then automation can ensure that the application of that well-defined interpretation to those facts is analytically sound and that mistakes don't get made. All right? And I'll get to bias in the next part, but this is just for accuracy. So that we can certainly say. But I think we need to recognize that we can diminish accuracy, at least in the sense that I've been using accuracy here, in some other respects. So in order to have this well-defined legal interpretation automated, you've got to put it into codable form, and it has to be communicated to programmers, or else the programmers themselves may put it in codable form. So just this process of doing this may warp the process of legal interpretation because it's not using the sort of legal process of legal interpretation. Also because it constrains the process of legal interpretation in certain ways, and may also obscure normative considerations, obscure the need for justifications of legal interpretation. Another way in which we can diminish accuracy, is that rather than being able to take sort of a very open-minded approach about which aspects of a factual situation might be relevant to the legal interpretation, we have to represent all facts in terms of available data proxies. So here again, going from the factors that are relevant in the law to available data proxies is another process that is interpretive and may distort the law, distort the actual application of the law. And again, if there are no explanations, then this idea that explanations are going to accumulate and allow us to facilitate legal reform may also be problematic. Although this one, I think there definitely could be ways to use in automated decision-making, to use other sorts of metrics to look at these questions. Okay, what about promoting fair and unbiased decisions? Well, first of all, it's pretty clear that computers don't have any pernicious motivations or implicit biases themselves, right? So that's an advantage, definitely, of automated decision-making. But of course, and as many people here know who've worked on the idea of fair and unbiased machine learning processes, first of all, pernicious motivations and implicit biases can affect the humans who are encoding the legal interpretations and selecting the factual data proxies for relevant facts. Now, automated decision offers some, and people are continuing to develop these, opportunities to encode certain metrics for fairness and bias into the system. And those metrics can be used to evaluate and improve decision-making, for sure. However, the selection of which metric to use is itself, and I think this is somebody already mentioned this earlier, is itself a normative decision and involves legal interpretation, particularly because there are often trade-offs, even between fairness and bias, at least in some ways of defining those things, and fairness and bias and other sorts of values, right? So selecting such a metric and telling the system to conform to it in some way itself may be an exercise of legal interpretation. So I think one might argue that these kinds of selections should be justified by explanations, even in the automated system. Finally, you can still have unintended consequences of correct application of legal rules. So I encode the rule, I use the data, I have good explanations of why I did that, and still it might be that when things actually work out in practice, I've got bad results. Unless there are explanations or some other form of ex post analysis of the decisions, there's no reason to think that automated decision processes are going to detect these sort of cumulative unintended consequences. This is not necessarily a worse situation than we have with traditional decision making, but it may be, right? Because we aren't able to look and see, wow, you know, we've got all these cases in which the explanation was these factors were what mattered, and somehow we're ending up with bad results. Okay, promoting legal compliance. So certainly some ways of encoding a legal rule require a precise specification of that rule. If that's the type of automated decision making you're using, and if you disclose the encoded rule, it will probably be more precise than the legal law was originally. And so it will probably be able to promote compliance with the encoded interpretation of the rule. Whether this is a good thing or not depends on whether the encoded interpretation of the rule is the right one, right? Whether it's a good interpretation. On the other hand, if the way we're encoding a rule is not by just encoding the rule directly, but coming from some process like a machine learning process, then I may have the problems we were mentioning earlier about I might not be able to interpret the rules, or maybe even if I can interpret the rules, so there are various techniques that people are working on to interpret the outcome of machine learning. Those interpretations may not be the kind of explanations that we normally think of. They may not be sort of causal descriptions according to normal legal analytics. They certainly are not going to be justifications. And so it might be that even when I know, so okay, I can see that some version of interpretation of the rule, it still doesn't tell me what to do. I still don't know how to comply with the law, right? You got this bad decision because there were these weights. These were the most important factors that affected the decision, which is, one very simple form of interpretation. There are many much more complicated ones. But still, unless the interpretation itself is something that I can look at and I can go, okay, now I know what to do, so I won't make this mistake again, then it's not going to be effective in promoting legal compliance. Promoting legitimacy and social trust. So there are some ways in which automated decision making can certainly promote legitimacy and social trust. So for example, there's a recent paper by Kroll et al. That suggests certain computational methods, some of them are cryptographic methods, by which one can certify that without an explanation of the decision, one can simply certify that this automated decision has followed a particular automated process, right? So it applied this rule to these facts. We can certify that even if we don't explain it. So that kind of accountability mechanism should be able to enhance legitimacy and trust. However, those methods don't work for the encoding or the legal interpretation aspect of automated decision making. And they also don't work for ensuring either that the factual data is accurate or that the factual data is an appropriate representation of the facts that are relevant from a legal perspective. So when there's no explanation of these aspects, you may still have a decrease in legitimacy and trust. I also just want to mention that simply transparency is not, it is descriptive explanation, but it is not justification. And in some kinds of, if we're talking about legal interpretation aspect, we need justification, or at least we ordinarily think we need justification. Also, I don't think that statistical correlation necessarily provides that kind of justification. Sufficient justification. And so the situations in which it does and doesn't needs thinking through, right? It might not be enough to just say, well, we have good, strong statistical correlation. That might not be enough to promote legitimacy, the legitimacy of the system and trust. Particularly if we have if there are sort of systematic issues with statistical correlation also usually means there are mistakes. There are false positives, false negatives. So if there's something about the system, the way the false positives and false negatives balance, or all the false positives are concentrated in a certain kind of area, we still might not have sufficient justification to promote legitimacy and trust. And then finally, promoting dignity and autonomy. So I think explanations play the same part in promoting dignity and autonomy for automated decisions as they do for traditional decision making. And if we don't have explanations, then this may be a concern. particular, and some versions of interpretability, as thought of, sort of in the machine learning community, might provide the kind of justifications that are needed to promote dignity and autonomy, but some versions will not, for some of the same reasons that I mentioned with respect to promoting legal compliance. So how am I doing on time?
Okay.
How much time do I have?
2 minutes.
Oh, okay, then I'm stopping. If you want to hear about investigation, you have to ask me.
Okay, so thank you. We have 5 minutes for a question. So, Javier?
Well, is there any experimental evidence about which kind of cognitive biases mostly affect legal interpretation by human decision makers? Because there are many cognitive biases, of course.
Sure.
I'm interested in knowing if there is some investigation about which are the cognitive biases mostly affecting legal interpretation.
So I don't think I have the answer. I know the answer to that. I know the answer to the question, are there empirical studies? That answer is yes. What they find, though, I don't entirely know. But there are empirical studies of legal decision makers. They're somewhat difficult to do because you have to get judges to agree to participate in them, and sometimes they're also hard to interpret. But for example, actually, a colleague of mine did an experiment, kind of an amazing experiment. They were able to get all these judges to agree to participate in an experiment where they decided hypothetical cases, and the question was the outcome different when the defendant is sort of an appealing figure versus a kind of nasty figure, and they found that there were differences. So that kind of example clearly is there, and I would assume that you would find other sorts of cognitive biases. And those might or might not be evident from looking at the explanations, just like any kind of bias. Explanations, I would think, would help for the same reason they should help for other kinds of biases, but they might not always solve the problem, for sure.
Yeah, in the previous talk, there was a question about the chain of trust. So is there a problem here with the chain of responsibility if you have an unstable system, so to speak? And so there's a many hands problem, so somehow you won't be able to attribute responsibility.
I think that, certainly that's possible. I think when we're talking about government decision making, people will usually attribute that responsibility to the government, right? So what might happen though is, and we haven't seen a lot of judicial review of these kinds of decisions, right? So one thing we might wonder about is, how does a reviewing court or agency or whatever look at one of these decisions? Do they say, and they may, well, the algorithm did what the algorithm did, and I'm just going to assume it did it right, and I'm going to review on other grounds, right? That might be how they approach it. In which case, that I would think would have significant issues about trust, but not so much because of the many hands aspect.
So just 2 questions and then.
Fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it. The one thing, looking at it from a computer science perspective, maybe a little bit of learning perspective, I was struck by is this notion of accuracy. In law, is it the case that the accuracy, so oftentimes in learning situations you assume that for a given context, if you need to make a decision, there exists an accurate decision, whether you know it or not, right? As opposed to one where I felt like it might, in the law situations, it might even depend on your ability to find the right explanation. And if you have the right explanation, either kinds of decisions could be justified, whether it is positive or negative. Or am I interpreting this the wrong way?
I think,
distinction there.
Yeah, so I think that you're right that when you speak about a correct legal decision, it's not an absolute thing, right? The question is, why is it not absolute? So one reason it might not be absolute is that different people have different normative takes. So if the decision involves some degree of legal interpretation, which is often going to be the case, then there will be normative assessments that go into that decision, and different people might make different normative assessments. It also could be that different decision makers will make different fact findings, will make different determinations as to what are the relevant facts. And those, again, can be disputed, but you could have different decisions that come out of that. As far as sort of coming to different decisions, sure, because legal analysis is not math, right? So you can make legal arguments for different outcomes, and the correct one, in some sense, is the one that the court accepts, right? So I think you're right that there is not, in the same way, this kind of, Platonian perfect outcome.
I'm very struck by the fact that codifying the thing precisely could actually lead to decrease in accuracy. That was something that to me was there was a cognitive.
Yeah, so I think that actually is really important, but I think there are two reasons for that. So one is you could be making incorrect or normatively indefensible interpretive decisions in the process of coding. So that might be one thing. The other thing, though, is that at least the common law and statutory and even interpretation of statutes in a common law jurisdiction can evolve to deal with new situations, new factual situations, new social situations, and so forth. So under the same statute, we can modify the legal interpretation a bit to deal with these new factual situations. Once you codify, you say these are the data, this is the data we need, this is the rule, then unless you go back in and reprogram it, it doesn't evolve.
Last one. Thanks a lot. That was very interesting. I have a question about, remark maybe, about the call-it-out paper that you mentioned. Is that the paper with many authors and has accountability without transparency?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I've been thinking a lot about that one, and I think that statement, this can increase trust, which the authors are, of course, making very strongly, is an empirical thing, and we don't have evidence for that. And I'm really worried about this. I have evidence from asking people about hypothetical anonymization technology at the moment that actually this may decrease trust, because without transparency, there seems to be this thing, they're building up this big apparatus that proves X, Y, and Z. They must have something to hide. And there is more of a front of, I would need to trust this and this and this, and a hiding of the actors behind, we've got this wonderful crypto here. So I think we've got to be really careful about that, and I thought when I considered this call-it-out also in the context of European data protection law, I don't think really that kind of thing would fly so well here, because transparency is such a basic requirement that building another layer of intransparency seems like warping the law in a sense.
Yeah, so I think that's very interesting and great, and is not totally surprising to me. So part of it is exactly a question of trust, right? If I trust this certifying institution, then I might trust them. If I don't, I don't, and I might need reasons to trust them. Transparency is a reason to trust them, and if there's no transparency, I got to have some other reason to trust them. So I think you're absolutely right, and the empirical evidence is very interesting. I thought that was the thing I was saying they got, so maybe not even that.
No, I think there is last remark. Paul makes a very good point about how when we make more and more constraints and put more and more formal rules in there, it actually makes people trust less. And we should keep that in mind when we build trust architectures. Thank you.
So thank you.